Einen wunderschönen guten Abend an einem verregneten Tag. Mein Name ist Matti Bunzle. Ich habe die Ehre und Freude, gemeinsam mit der Christina Schwarz das Wien-Museum zu leiten. Wir freuen uns riesig, so viele Interessierte hier zu begrüßen. Es ist ein für uns sehr bedeutsamer Abend. Timothy Snyder ist für mich der vielleicht wichtigste Historiker unserer Zeit und ihm zuzuhören ist immer eine Freude und obwohl was er sagt ist meistens sehr traurig, aber es ist leider sehr überzeugend und brillant. Dieses Event machen wir zusammen mit unseren engen Kollegen und guten Freunden vom IWM, dem Institut für die Wissenschaft von Menschen. Was ihr macht, ist großartig, wirklich. Es ist seit vielen Jahren. Und Wien kann man gar nicht sich vorstellen, die intellektuelle Szene ohne euch. Und wir werden gemeinsam wieder beim Vienna Humanities Festival 2 Abende hier gemeinsam gestalten. Auch ein Partner ist das International Institute for Peace. Und da möchte ich mich ganz herzlich bedanken bei Stephanie Fenkert und dem Team. Und ich werde auch jetzt an die Stephanie weitergeben, die uns unseren Speaker vorstellen wird. Not that he needs an introduction, but we're in Vienna, so there will be one.
Thank you very much, Matthias Bunzl. Sorry. Thank you very much for the introduction. I will already speak in English. Dear guests, on behalf of the International Institute for Peace, I would like to welcome you to this lecture that Timothy Snyder has kindly agreed to deliver. The topic is Belarus, Ancient and Modern, a consideration of a Central European history. Belarus is a little known and often misunderstood country in Europe, bordering the European Union, Ukraine, and the Russian Federation. While the protests, we remember in 2020 against the fraudulent presidential elections, by the way, among the largest in the post-Soviet space, briefly made it into international headlines, the country quickly faded from the spotlight once again. Then, obviously, with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, launched in part also from Belarusian territory, Belarus came to be seen by many as a co-aggressor in the war. Even before that, it was frequently viewed as a satellite of Russia, but after 2022, the association with Moscow grew even stronger. While it is easy to recognize the current limits of Belarus' sovereignty and the question of legitimacy of the repressive nature of its political regime, one cannot deny the existence of a distinct Belarusian nation with its own history, identity, and vision for the future as an independent state. The story of Belarus begins long before the fall of the Soviet Union or even its formation. And I am glad that this lecture, Timothy Snyder will paint the Belarusian history in full color, showing us how Belarus came to be and what possibilities it has today to survive as a nation and a state during the hard times it is currently experiencing. It was already mentioned before, Professor Snyder barely needs an introduction. Very briefly though, most of you do know him as the leading American historian specializing in Central Europe, Ukraine, the Soviet Union, democracy, and recently also on freedom and authoritarianism. He holds the chair in Modern European History at the University of Toronto and is a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. The editor of 20 books translated into 40 languages, Professor Snyder has recently also received an honorary doctorate from the University of Oxford. But before we get started, thanks again to Wien Museum and Mr. Bunzl, and sorry again for the wrong introduction. And thanks again also to the Institute for Human Sciences, without whom this event would not have been possible. But now please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Snyder. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here in Vienna. It's a great pleasure to be in this museum among friends. It's a great pleasure to see this museum develop into the beautiful space that it's become. And it's also a great pleasure to have the chance to try to think and speak a bit experimentally here about the history and perhaps the future of Belarus. Vienna is despite the general grimness and grumpiness of its population day to day, historically a city of political possibility, historically a city of political imagination, and historically a capital of a realm in which many nations, which were thought to be impossible, in fact came to be. So I can't think of a better place to consider the history of Belarus and to consider its possible futures. Vienna, as many of you will also know, is perhaps the center of the history of the study of nationality as such, whether we're speaking of the obscure topic of my doctoral dissertation, a Polish sociologist called Kazimierz Kallis-Kraus, or of the better-known sociologist, or rather anthropologist, Ernest Gellner. The whole discussion about whether the nation is something old or something new, something inherent or something constructed, something which has to do with the ancient or something which has to do with the modern, that whole discussion has largely taken place in Vienna, or has been about Vienna, or has been about these territories. So as we consider the question that Stephanie kindly raised about where Belarus comes from, how it starts, what it is, again, I can't think of a better place to do this than in Vienna. So let me start with that very basic question, which I'm now going to answer for you, so you will no longer have to be concerned with it. Is the nation something old, or is the nation something new? The answer, of course, Carl Henrik in the first row wins the prize. The answer is both. Of course, the answer is both. What the nation is has to do with deep, deep, deep layers of history, of most of which we're probably unaware of. It has to do with encounters and global flows and migrations and layers of which we're only dimly aware. It has to do with the deep past. It doesn't really have to do with the deep past that nationalists would like us to believe in, which of course doesn't really exist. It's not the case that you can drop a sort of vertical plumb line from the present into the past and find ethnic people of your own group all the way down. That simply is impossible. It's not true for anyone. So it's not the deep past of nationalists in which there's one group, which is always, by the way, innocent and never does anything wrong and which has existed forever. That past does not exist. But it is a deep past of layers and complexity and encounters which one can joyfully and hopefully interestingly discover. And it is modernity. It's modernity as well. Now, it's not the flat modernity of hopeful liberals or hopeful socialists who would like to believe that someday we will all be equally rational and all have the same interests and all see the world in the same way. That has never happened, and I can say with some confidence, will never happen. It's not that kind of modernity which can comfortably dismiss history or claim that history has come to an end. It's a modernity in which, as we see the state try to make citizens educated, people half rebel and take on identities of their own, or take on the identity that the state wants them to, but not in exactly the way that the state wants them to. So it's a modernity which is very real, which involves mass politics, mass education, the press, today the internet, but which is not flat and which is not predictable. And what history is also not, and this will be a talk about history, history is certainly not the frozen past of autocrats. The 21st century, the period through which we live, sees this very strange combination of a frozen past and the absence of a future, which is generated by, or at least surrounded by, a kind of postmodern lack of care, unconcern about the facts themselves. The way it works is always like this. You take a moment in the past, you pick that moment, whether it's a baptism in the 10th century or whether it's a war in the middle of the 20th century, and you say, this was a moment of perfect innocence. Nothing of any significance has happened since then. I, the dictator, am telling you this, and therefore I personally shall have power forever. And that is the formula which in different ways, with different reference points, both Vladimir Putin in Russia and Alexander Lukashenko in Belarus use. The innocence of a past people, some kind of perfect starting point, is meant to prove that the current dictator, the current ruling person, has the right to be in charge forever. Now, in Russia and Belarus, there's some overlap in these stories, but the main starting points, I think it's fair to say, are different. In Russia, the starting point is 988, and the conversion of his name was actually Valdemar. The name was Valdemar. I know. I mean, for all you Ukrainians out there, I'm happy to say Volodymyr, but his name was actually Valdemar. He was a murderer, rapist, slave trading Viking, not the lovable figure that you were raised to believe he was. But the moment that he forced his people to become Christian so he could dominate them is the moment which is seen as the beginning of a joint Russian or Belarusian sort of triad of states. That's how Putin proclaims it. Lukashenko generally prefers 1939 or 1945, the Second World War, as a moment of complete Belarusian innocence or victimhood. But either way, that's not how history works. History includes complexity. It includes layers and layers. It includes surprises. So if you're not surprised by something, then you're not reading a good history book. If you read a history book and it tells you the things you already think, that is a bad history book, and you should put it aside and try to get your money back and buy a different one. And also, if you're a historian or aspiring to be a historian, and your hypothesis about what happened in the past turns out to be true, that's not because you're a lucky genius. It's because you haven't done the research correctly, because your hypothesis will always turn out to be wrong in some important respect, and then you change your hypothesis and you keep trying and you keep working. And history, of course, also includes the principle of non-contradiction. It includes that we don't say things like, the moment that my country made an alliance with Nazi Germany is also the moment in which we proved we were against Nazism, which is the current Belarusian state ideology. And it also includes ethics. Ethics are a part of history, and that's one way the ethical commitments of the historian to objectivity, but also the ethical commitments of people in the past are part of the subject. And so in that way, history is quite different from a sort of nihilism which says we don't care what actually happened in the past. All we need is some memory story, some kind of politics of memory, which will make it easy to rule now. So what history is, as I see it, is as an accumulation of mostly non-national things. The nations start to come into focus in the 19th and the 20th century, and then the 21st, I would argue. By the way, it tends to be the nations that are newest, that focused most intensively on the ancient past, right? So Russia, which is very much a nation in formation, is therefore obsessively concerned with events that happened 1,000 years ago. In general, that's the way that things work. But most of the history which leads to the nation is not national, right? Just like, and I'm going to tell you something shocking about your lives, most of the history which led to you being you was not you, right? We may believe it's mostly about us, but it's not, right? It's mostly about many other people who are beside us or who came before us, and we may not perceive it all. With the nation, it's very similar. Nations tend to be self-centered and narcissistic, but the things that allowed them to happen came before or were on the side. And so the history of a nation is actually mostly non-national. It's mostly about things that happened before, layers and encounters. And then it's also the history of modernity, the history of centralization and attempts at conformity. It's the history of empires and capitalism and today digital capitalist empires and the reaction to those things. It's about the general or the attempt to make the general, but also the particular, the way the particular reacts to the general always. So today I'm going to try to talk about in a few steps, 4 or 5 steps, is the Belarusian particular. Now, Stephanie's introduction was too generous. I'm not going to be able to tell you everything about Belarusian history, why it was the way it was, and what's going to happen next. The most that I can do, I would say in the time that's allotted, but that's not the problem. The problem's not the time. The limit is me. The most that I can do is give you a few ideas about how I see the particularity of Belarusian history in that non-national period, and then also in the national period of the modern. So the first gambit here, the first effort that I want to make is to suggest that Belarus is the place in European history where a couple of our major zones of ancient interest actually meet. That there's one place in history, actually there are probably several, but one place which is right in the center where one zone of fascination, which is the ancient Greek world, the Greek world of the 7th, 6th, 5th, 4th, 3rd centuries BC, and the Iron Age Viking world, the world of the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th centuries AD. Those two zones, which are very important for our history, but I would also suggest extremely important for our imagination, also in contemporary culture, that Belarus is a place where those two moments actually overlap. So let me try to make that case first. The Greeks. So, and this, by the way, is a point that I want to make about history in general, that what we do sometimes when we pursue national history is we look for the things that only happen on a certain territory, and in that way we end up impoverishing the territory itself, because nothing only happens on your territory, unless you're America, of course. But nothing only, I appreciate the gradations of laughter, the different kinds of laughter that provoked. So nothing only ever happens on your territory. And so as you exclude the things that happen in other places as well, you end up with a sort of vacuum, right? And what's interesting about Belarus is that it's a place where many things overlap. And the overlappingness of it all can be what's interesting. There is no, in my view, there is no zone like Belarus, either in ancient or in modern history. But you can't make that claim without looking at the things that overlap. So the Greeks, let me just say a word about the ancient Greeks. When we think about them, when we think about the ancient Greeks, I'm just noticing now that there's no clock on the wall. There's just a beautiful view of the trees. And so there's just no constraint on how long I'm going to go on. When we think about the ancient Greeks, we think about Athens. We think about Athens as though it was a kind of self-contained zone where people, ideally in togas, had nothing to do but walk around and invent philosophy and mathematics and so on. All that happened on the Black Sea, actually. But we think of Greece as this kind of self-contained zone where mythology, philosophy, mathematics comes into being. But the reason why Athens was possible, had to do with a much bigger set of political and economic networks. In terms of it, there was actually no Greece as such economically. There was a much bigger zone of Greece and Scythia together, which a zone of trading which went across the Black Sea to the North Black Sea coast. It was the grain, but also the slaves and many other commodities from the other side of the Black Sea, which kept Greece going. And so to tell the story of Greece, you actually have to tell the story of an encounter of two peoples, because there is no Greece without Scythia. The Greeks and the Scythians arrive at the Black Sea at exactly the same time. The Greeks are coming by boat, the Scythians are coming on horseback, they're nomads, but they reach the Black Sea, the North Black Sea coast, at exactly the same time. And what the Scythians do with that encounter is no less interesting or impressive than what the Greeks do with it. The Scythians fill up the space of the steppe, which is now Ukraine and southern Belarus. They recognize that the Greek cities on the coast will be places that they can trade. They recognize that the steppe is a place that can be farmed, and they recognize that the forest steppe is a zone that can be traded with. So you have this encounter between Greek-speaking Greeks Iranian-speaking Scythian nomads, which leads to a north-south zone of trade, which includes what is now southern Belarus. So we have Scythian blades from southern Belarus from the mid-7th century BC. We have coins from Greek Black Sea cities found in what's today Belarus, no later than the 5th century BC. So you have an interaction, which is a Greek-Scythian interaction, but at its north edge is also an interaction between the Scythians and what the archaeologists call the Milorad culture, possibly early Baltic Slavic people, in which honey, fur, slaves, and other commodities are traded. So this is one big economic zone. Without this big economic zone, there is no Greece. There is also no Scythia as we understand it. We know more about the Greeks than the Scythians because the Greeks wrote things down and the Scythians didn't. Although we do have extraordinary Scythian art, including, for example, the famous pectoral from Tofstomohila, which if you don't know it, look it up after this lecture. It's a beautiful portrayal in the pectoral is what probably a leader or maybe even the king of the Scythians wore around his neck. It's an enormous decoration in gold where the bottom layer is death, the middle layer is the tree of life, and then the third layer is a story of power. The middle layer is probably the world tree, which is the beginning of Indo-European mythology. So this civilization, which we take to be, which we locate in Athens, or we think about as Greek, actually has something to do with what's now southern Belarus. And this whole cultural inheritance, everything that comes along with it, the Greek mythology, the contemporary references to Amazons, whatever it might be, all of this goes back to this zone. The Amazons, by the way, were real, in case you were wondering. No, the Amazons were in fact real. Oh, I have to do an excursus on this. All right, I will. So in the Scythian territories of the steppe, roughly 20% of the finds of armed human beings are biologically female. So ancient DNA has come to the rescue here because for a century and a half, the female warriors were identified, despite their pelvic structures and their smaller size, as small warriors. But thanks to science, we now are able to ascertain that these were biological females. And so the reason why there is a Greek legend of the Amazons is because of their actual encounter with actual fighting women on horseback. Okay, just bracket that. Hence, right? No Wonder Woman, right? So now you're getting the real payoff of this lecture. Okay, the Vikings. So if the first question I was asking was something like, how are the Greeks possible? And the answer is the Greeks are possible because of this much bigger political economic network which stretches across the Black Sea into the steppe, into the forest steppe. The second question I want to ask is something like, how were the Vikings interesting? Why did the Vikings become so interesting? I mean, if you don't think the Vikings were interesting, this is when you can get your coffee. But I take it as given that Norse mythology is interesting, and there's a question as to where on earth it came from, right? So how do you get this Viking god Thor, who is associated not just with storms and the thunderbolt and lightning and power and righteous warfare, but also with the law and the social contract and fertility and farming? Or more interesting still, how do you get this Norse god Odin, who is a god of both creation and death, a god of poetry, I think fundamentally a god of mystery, someone who hangs himself from that Indo-European world tree in the search for wisdom, someone who sacrifices one of his eyes to a well in the search for wisdom. This is just a tiny bit of what I think is the most interesting set of stories in Europe at the time from, let's say, the 7th through the 11th centuries AD. Far more interesting, with all due respect, than the Christianity that supplanted it, I think by orders of magnitude. You don't win arguments because you're more interesting, historically, right? You win arguments because you supply ideologies which allow for a new kind of politics. Okay, so how are these interesting ideas, these interesting myths possible? I talked a moment ago about a kind of miniature Greek globalization, where, of course, Greek culture is not just Athens, it's also the Mediterranean and the Near East and the Black Sea, and even, to some extent, the steppe. The Viking globalization was actually something much larger, much grander. The Vikings were on every continent except Antarctica and Latin America. Every single one. They reached them all by sea, either by salt water or by rivers. But as we are coming to understand, mostly thanks to the archaeologists who are doing splendid work in Poland and in Ukraine, it is that, and in the Baltic states, the most important route for the Vikings, economically, and as I'm about to claim, also ideologically, was what they called the East Way. The East Way. They were drawn to the east and then to the south, chiefly by the wealth of the Arabs, by what was then the dominant civilization of the time. They were drawn by Arab silver, for which they traded. The same kinds of commodities, by the way, a bit of honey, some furs, probably chiefly slaves. So the Viking Age actually begins, I think, with contact with Slavs in the southern Baltic. And then you see Vikings move, beginning in the 7th century and early 8th century, through the eastern Baltic, either through the Gulf of Finland or through the Gulf of Riga. Through the Gulf of Riga, as all the Belarusians here will know, you then pass through the Dwina River, which is today across northern Belarus, about 330 kilometers of it. And by way of these river passages, which the Vikings took for no short period of time, 400 or 500 years, we're talking about, by way of these northern passages, they were passing through lands that are inhabited by Balts, speakers of Baltic languages, speakers of Finnic languages, and of course, speakers of Slavic languages. For hundreds of years, they were passing through the Baltic states and what we now think of as the Baltic states, what we now think of as Belarus, as well as what we now think of as northeastern Russia. The famous route, the most famous route, the one that went to Byzantium, passed through Belarus. So anytime you're thinking of Vikings going from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, you have to remember that's the Dwina River. That requires going through northern Belarus. I don't know how many readers out here we have of the Elder Edda, the fundamental poetic source of Norse mythology. But if you just read a few pages into it, you get to the Grimnismal, which is a famous poem recited by Odin, in which he recounts the most important rivers of the world. And the very first one that he mentions is the Dwina. When Saxo Grammaticus writes his history of the origins of the Danish kingdom, he names an important Slavic warlord precisely after the Dwina River. The Dwina River was absolutely central to how the Vikings went east, and they knew it, and it remains in their stories even long after they convert to Christianity and are largely driven out of the east. It remains in their myths if we know where to read it out. So the point I want to make here is that I think we can solve the mystery of why the Vikings are interesting in this way. The Donar, the thunder god of the Germans, is a boring fellow. Some rocks knocked together, there's some lightning bolts, hooray. The Wotan of the Germans, he does have these night festivals where you hunt after dark, and that's maybe a little bit more interesting. But neither of these Germanic characters can possibly explain the complexity, the richness, the sophistication, the resonances of Thor and Odin and of Nordic mythology generally. I think the only way you get to that is by understanding that for roughly 500 years, the Scandinavians were going a Viking with Finns, with Balts, and with Slavs. Vikings were not ethnic Swedes. They were not ethnic anything in particular, and they brought together with them Balts and Slavs and Finns. By Finns, I also include Estonians here. And regardless of that, for roughly 500 years, they passed through again and again in these journeys that took weeks and months and required many stops, territories which were themselves still pagan, where other and perhaps more interesting pagan rituals and identities were being followed and existed. So just to give you an example, Donar, the German, boring Germanic, thunder god, becomes Thor, I think, because for hundreds of years, the Vikings are in contact with the Finnish Ukko, who's a much more interesting character. I would love to explain to you exactly how, I don't know, is it late enough in the day for this? But rather than knocking stones together, he has a much more interesting way, which is very appropriate for the history of the museum and Freud and all of that. He has a much more interesting way of bringing about the thunderstorm. I will just leave it at that. So you've all figured it out already. The interesting thing about it, though, is that he's on the bottom. Okay. Consider that. It's very 21st century of it. Or the Baltic Perkunas, right? The Baltic god of thunder, or the Slavic Perun. These gods, who are like the Germanic Donar, but are more interesting, have wider features, I think are the way that Thor becomes the more interesting god that he eventually becomes. Odin is an even more interesting case, I think. Odin, who is the god of both killing and journeys, the god of taking chances, the god who took a chance by hanging himself from a tree, who took a chance by sacrificing his own eye. Those ideas seem to come from nowhere until you learn something a bit about the religious context that the Vikings were passing through. The Finns and the Estonians and the Balts had the idea that a well or a swamp or a place with water is where you would find the eye of Veles. And once you understand that, the notion of Odin sacrificing his eye in a well, by the way, becomes less confusing. The notion of hanging from a tree, and by the way, also the notion of Valhalla, chosen people ascending rather than descending, almost certainly comes from Turkic peoples, from the Volga Bulgars, to which the Vikings were passing when they were passing through northeastern Europe. When the Vikings, or as they were known in Eastern Europe, the Rus, when the Vikings or the Rus worshipped Odin or prayed to Odin for success in commerce, they seem to have done so by making a circle of stakes in the ground, which is a ritual common to the Balts and the Slavs, as well as to them. And so then by the time we get to the 10th century, the middle of the 10th century, the greatest of the Viking lords, who was, of course, Sviatoslav, whose name was probably Sveinald, by the way, but who remember as Sviatoslav, we have armies of Finnish speakers, Baltic speakers, Slavic speakers, led by these Scandinavians, fighting both on horseback and from ships, which is not such an easy thing to pull off 1,000 years ago, campaigning against the Byzantines through the Balkans, as well as against the Bulgars, thousands of kilometers away, fighting in the lifetime of this one chieftain over the range of about 8,000 kilometers. Sviatoslav was probably the most interesting Viking, probably the most interesting person on these terrains, in my view. It's his son, Valdemar/Volodymyr, who manages to take power after his death, who's married, by the way, to a princess with a Scandinavian name from Polotsk, which is an important, of course, North Belarusian city. And it's through this character of Valdemar or Volodymyr or Vladimir that the story returns to Greece, because as you will all know, as readers of the Chronicle of bygone times, when Vladimir, in this famous story of how he rejects Western Christianity, rejects Islam, rejects Judaism, accepts quote unquote Eastern Christianity from Greece, the question he asks it's an interesting question. He asks, supposedly Constantine, well, why did Jesus hang himself from a tree? And of course, Jesus didn't hang himself from a tree. That was Odin who hanged himself from a tree, which reminds you where this is all coming from and where it finally meets. And of course, the tree from which Odin hanged himself, Yggdrasil, was the world tree. the world tree of the Scythians, the world tree of the ancient Indo-Europeans. And so at that moment, it's the year 988 when Valdemar baptizes himself. It's not a moment of something new or fresh. The man, as I say, was a usurper and a murderer and a rapist, and not particularly morally approvable. But it wasn't a moment when history started again or fresh, right? It was a moment where many older things met Christianity and moved on from there. And the reason, by the way, Christianity was useful for Valdemar is that the cults of Thor and Odin are rival cults. They're cults of predictability versus unpredictability. Thor is the cult of the farmer. Odin is the cult of the adventurer. The only way to get to a centralized state is to have a single god. And so hence the attraction. Okay. So, and again, if the Vikings become interesting, if Thor becomes Thor and Odin becomes Odin because of the Vienna River and this long encounter with Finns and Balts and Slavs, that also has huge implications for our own contemporary culture. Insofar as we think Norse mythology is interesting, or insofar as we're willing to admit that we've gone to see Marvel movies which have Thor in them, right? Thank you for being the one person here in the second row who admits it. I know there are many more of you. You win the second prize. Carl Henrik won the first prize. You win second prize. But this, regardless of whether you watch the movies or not, these images of Thor and Odin and the other Norse gods play an immense role in our culture. And so insofar as we accept that, we're also accepting that this encounter matters a lot. But you can see also the point that I'm making here, which is that it's in Belarus, it's in southern Belarus, right, the forest steppe, where we can see the edges of the Greek zone. It's in northern Belarus, but not only, the Dvina River, where we can see the Viking culture become itself. It's in this zone that these two grand civilizations, the significance of which we can't really deny, no matter how decadent and no matter how internet focused we become, are both present. Okay. So then I'm going to close with a couple of more familiar arguments. The next is that, and this, I think there are a few Belarusians who will, no doubt will have some disagreements about the details, but I think few Belarusians would disagree with this. When the state of Rus, which is founded by this character Valdemar, and which lasts for a couple of hundred years, although it's extremely messy the entire time, when that state collapses finally with the invasion of the Mongols in 1241, it's the Grand Duchy of Lithuania which preserves the continuity of the civilization of Rus. So Rus means Eastern Vikings, by the way. That's what it means originally. It then shifts to mean a state which some of these Eastern Vikings found with a capital in Kiev. And then after that, it slowly becomes the name of an elite, and then eventually people who speak language around that elite or have a certain kind of Christianity. So in the 13th century, in the middle of the 13th century, when Rus breaks up, it's the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, where you have the closest thing to continuity in the history of the Rus. It's the Lithuanians who integrate most of the lands of Rus. It's the Lithuanians who claim the title of being king of Rus. It's in these lands where some of the larger families of Rus are able to preserve their property. The court language in Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, becomes a Slavic language. The law codes are written in a Slavic language. And this is continuity, just I'll make the point by way of contrast. This is continuity as opposed to what happens in Muscovy. What happens in Muscovy is very much not continuity. In Muscovy, under the much longer rule of the Mongols, essentially random figures become leaders based upon their ability to collect the tribute. The children of the future leaders or the children of the current leaders are raised in sarai and adopt and copy Mongol administrative habits. And it's not a criticism of that, just to note that it is something different. It's not a continuity. Another interesting difference is that in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, a bit later, you have, but not in Muscovy, you have the very significant settlement of Jews, such that Belarusian towns, and Ukrainian towns for that matter as well, like Polish towns, become largely Jewish towns. And that's something which is different about this part of the world as opposed to Russia. This is also continuity of Rus as opposed to Poland. The Lithuanian Grand Dukes, of course, become the rulers of Poland, which they will be for the next couple hundred years. But before they become the rulers of Poland, they already have a Slavic-speaking court. They are already Slavic speakers, most of them themselves. And as the rulers of Poland, they preserve a certain distinction for the territories of historical Lithuania. The Lithuanian law codes continue to function, the Lithuanian law codes which come from Rus and which are written in a Slavic language. Land in Lithuania can only be owned by Lithuanians, which means in large measure, big, magnate, aristocratic, as we would say now, oligarchic, big aristocratic families of Rus. When the Bible is translated by Skaryna in 1517, it's translated into a Belarusian recension of Church Slavonic. A turning point here, I believe, a very important turning point, is 1569, when a Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is created in which Polish law is then applied directly to Ukraine, but not to Belarus and Lithuania. I think it's in 1569 that you see a line created which hadn't existed before, and that's the beginning of a difference between what's Belarus and what's Ukraine. So this Commonwealth then survives as the homeland of most of Rus for another couple hundred centuries until 1795 and the Third Partition of Poland. So the next step, which again I think won't be controversial to many Belarusians, but which I think is very interesting, is the period of empire and the Soviet period, which involves national revival. Now, the national revivals are interesting because the national revivals in the 19th century, we're talking about the 19th century now. So the Russian Empire exists. It's existed since 1721. It's partitioned Poland, which I should say Poland, Lithuania, by 1795. So in the 19th century, we have national revivals in Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine, which in my view are fundamentally similar. That is to say, they all reject at an obvious level Russian rule, but they all must also reject the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, because the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was, although it was a republic and more people could vote in it than anywhere in Europe until England in the 1830s, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was ruled by elites. It was a republic in the old sense of the word. And so if you want to have modern politics, the politics of a nation, you have to reach out to more people, which means you can't embrace noble rule or property owning by aristocrats as the wave of the future. So all four of these nations follow this path. They look for a past in which people who speak the same language were somehow all together. Historically, that's very problematic, and politically, it can be problematic as well. The Belarusian national activists of the 19th century follow this pattern, but perhaps in a gentler form. The rejection of the Commonwealth is less dramatic than that of the Lithuanians. When they talk about politics, they're generally aware that some kind of future Belarus will involve Lithuanians or Poles or Jews. Belarusians, however, face some objective disadvantages, apropos Lithuania and Poland and even Ukraine. And these have to do with the advantages of partition. So if you're a Pole, and I know some of you are out there, I can almost tell by like how you perk up every time I mention Poland. And now I can really tell. You've been taught that partition is a bad thing. And of course, it seems like a very bad thing, and it's very easy to illustrate as something terrible. You imagine a national body, it's been dismembered, one arm is here, one leg is there, it's very terrible. But it's better to be partitioned than absorbed. That's the lesson of the 19th century. So Ukraine has a Galician Habsburg part as well as a Russian imperial part. The Lithuanians have some people over there on the German side who can print some books. The Poles are divided among three empires, the Prussians, the Habsburgs, and the Russians. And if you pick a decade and one of them is less oppressive than the others, and from that less oppressive one, you can do things that the other ones can't do. So there's actually an advantage of being partitioned, which the Belarusians did not enjoy. All of what's now Belarus is on the Russian side, subjected only to one partitioning power. And although it might seem ironic, It's during this period that Polish culture advances into the Belarusian elite. Not just the Polish period, but also the Russian period is a period of Polish advance in high culture. And then in the 20th century, the Belarusian national movement also faces quite substantial objective disadvantages. In the 1920s and 1930s, to be sure, Belarus is partitioned. The western bits are in Poland, and the central and eastern bits are in the Soviet Union. But Poland pursues a pretty consistently oppressive policy vis-a-vis Belarusian culture. Much more oppressive, by the way, than vis-a-vis Ukrainian culture, where there are important moments of actually encouraging Ukrainian culture inside Poland. It's also the case that whereas many national movements, the Czechs, for example, with Prague, or the Hungarians with Budapest, or the Poles, for that matter, with Warsaw, many national movements are able to incorporate what they regard as their largest and most important city. For Belarusians, that city was Vilnius. And although one could have a whole lecture about the justice or injustice of this, it's just a matter of fact that in losing Vilnius to Lithuania, the Belarusian national movement was losing something very important during the First World War, after the First World War, and then inside the Soviet Union, where Soviet leaders, by the way, considered it both ways, but ended up giving Lithuania, letting Lithuania have Vilnius after the First World War, and then in 1939. So and then we have the very special, and again, all Belarusians here or people from Belarus will understand this, the very special experience of Belarus inside the Soviet Union. And here I want to enunciate another general principle of history, at least something worth considering as a hypothesis. Often the less we know about something, the more important it is, rather than the other way around. Often we know about things because some institution has been successful and therefore has a very good propaganda department or education ministry or whatever you choose to call it. But the things from the past which reach us are not reaching us because of their significance. They're reaching us because of subsequent generations' institutional capability to project them, which is something quite different, right? So the center of the horror of the Second World War is Belarus, I think objectively without question. And yet that is not the reference that almost anyone would find when asked the question of where the center of horror would be. And that horror begins after an age of terror in the Soviet Union, 1937 and 1938, when the flower of the Belarusian intelligentsia is murdered. Then the Soviet Union allies with Nazi Germany in 1939, which brings German force, the German army, right up to the edge of what is Belarus, Soviet Belarus, so that when the German invasion begins, it can roll right through Belarus, which is the main invasion route. I can't tell the whole history of the occupation. You all have a sense, I'm sure, of how horrible it was. But in terms of the regions of the Soviet Union, and for that matter of Europe, the Belarusian SSSR had the highest fatality rates anywhere, not just in the USSR, but in all of Europe. And Belarusians as a people, as counted by the Soviet census, suffer more than anyone else except for the Jews. So it's and Belarus is the center of crimes that we know of and crimes that we may not know of. It's the center of the Holocaust. It's a center of the Holocaust by bullets. It's also a center of the starvation of Soviet prisoners of war, which is much less familiar. And then for people who aren't from Belarus, it's the so-called anti-partisan operations, which the Germans carried out, were also centered in Belarus and involved the destruction of countless Belarusian villages and were a huge war crime on their own. So that was, so the Second World War has this horrifying effect on many nations of destroying minority populations. In the case of the Belarus, that would be most significantly the Jews. It has the horrifying consequence for many nations of destroying educated people disproportionately. That's also the case in Belarus. For some nations, it has the horrifying consequence of killing a very significant percentage of the population overall. That's true for Belarus more than it's true for anyone else. And of course, The irony of all of this, and now I'm moving in closing to how we think about history and how history is thought of by the present regime, or how the present regime invites us to think about history. The irony of all of this is that the present regime invites us to think about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the beginning of the Second World War as something good. There's an official day of national remembrance around September 17th, and September 17th is, of course, the day that the Soviet Union invades Eastern Poland as the ally of Nazi Germany. It's, of course, that's the day when territories which are now Belarusian, not notionally join the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, just as with Ukraine, it's the same with Western Ukraine. But the deeper reality, or let's say a reality which can't be overlooked, is that's also the day when the Soviet-Nazi military alliance is realized. After the Soviets carry out that march, they meet the Germans and they carry out a joint victory march. And this isn't just symbolic. This is a central event of the 20th century. It is very hard to imagine how the Second World War could have happened in anything like the form that it did happen without the Soviet-German alliance. Had the Soviet Union not chosen to ally with Germany, had it done nothing, it's very hard to see how Germany could have taken all the territory that it did. The alliance with Nazi Germany was probably the single worst thing that could have happened to Europe at that moment. But the irony here, given Belarusian memory laws, which require you, so the things I've just said would lead to a prison sentence in Belarus, Russia too, for that matter. But the irony of all of this is the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was the single worst thing that could have been done to Belarus itself, because the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact uniquely created the situation in which the German army was already in ethnic Belarusian territories inside Poland. It created a situation in which the German army could invade central Belarus in the first days of the war. It created a situation in which Stalin wrongly did not understand that Germany was about to invade. In other words, the day that is now celebrated as a day of national unity in Belarus in the Lukashenko regime is probably the single worst thing that possibly could have happened to the Belarusian nation, but also to all the peoples who lived in Belarus. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is also the factor which makes it possible for us to understand the Holocaust. It's in that Molotov-Ribbentrop zone where that the Holocaust actually begins. And of course, this is another nihilistic irony about contemporary Belarusian memory policy, where we are required to remember a genocide of the Belarusian people, but precisely in order not to remember the mass killing of the Jews. That's the point of the whole operation. So there's a deep irony here, which is that, and it's an irony which points to this kind of 21st century postmodern nihilism, that the people who behave like Nazis are the ones who get to call the opposition Nazis. And you commemorate an alliance with Nazis in the name of claiming that you're rejecting them. The result being that you end up with a Verharmlosung, you end up with a trivialization of what Nazi Germany actually is, and you end up with a complete contradiction, you end up with a complete illogic at the center of what is supposed to be your nation's memory. So with Russia, and I'll close with this reference to the Russo-Ukrainian War. With Russia, of course, the moment is not 1939, although that matters. The moment is 988, and this baptism of Valdemar. The idea that Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine in 988 were somehow formed into an eternally changeless national union at that moment when Valdemar converted. It's not just that it's wrong. I mean, we can talk about why it's wrong, right? It's wrong because it's an essentially Scandinavian story. It's wrong because pretty much everything in the Chronicle of Bygone Years is plagiarized from another Scandinavian saga. The entire Chronicle of Bygone Years, which is the basic source for the Putinist or the Russian imperial myth, is an Icelandic saga that happens to be written in Church Slavonic, and pretty much everything in it is copied from other Scandinavian stories. Which, if there's basically no substance to it, sorry. It's an interesting Scandinavian source among thousands of others. It's nothing more than that. But it's also wrong because there weren't any nations in 988 to be unified forever. It's fundamentally wrong, though, in the deepest possible sense, because that's not how history works. There just aren't moments, baptisms, wars, or any other moments, where things start fresh and where people never change and where we're always innocent there from that moment forward, thenceforward, for all time. It is more historical, or it's the beginning of history, to say that just as there were no nations in 988, there have been nations for the last couple of hundred years. They are forming in contact with the past and in contact with one another. The lands of Belarus and the national history of the lands of Belarus are informed by Slavic, but also Baltic, also Finnish, and then later on Jewish, and to some extent Mongol and Tatar and other influences. That's just the way history is. There is no one source of national history. And this, of course, brings us to where I want to close, which is something that I'm sure many of you have thought about, which is the dilemma or a dilemma of national reconstruction. When faced with imperialism, when faced with an imperial story about how one powerful people was always in fact innocent and therefore can do no wrong in the present and future, it is very tempting to copy that story simply on a smaller scale. But of course, to do that is to deny the basis of one's own history. To do that is, in fact, to allow imperialism to win, with the appearance of challenging it. Because while the national history of Belarus is the national history of Belarusians, it's also the national history of everything which happened for all those centuries and millennia before there were Belarusians. And it's also the history of all the encounters which happened during the modern period among Belarusians and other peoples. And it does give me hope that when I contemplate the Belarusians I know, and I'm very happy to have friends among people who are exiled, when I think about the protests of 5 years ago, what I experience mostly is an acceptance of this sense of plurality and historical experimentation and difference, not as something negative, but as something positive. And that's important because fundamentally, the reason why empires, these postmodern empires, the reason why Russia, the reason why Lukashenko for that matter, the reason why they deny the complexity and the blurriness and the layers of the past is to remove the possibility of a future which has complexity and layers and encounters, which is the only kind of future which can possibly be democratic. So getting history right, or accepting that history is interesting and a discovery and an experiment and unpredictable, is one step, not the only one, because there's so many other more courageous things to be done. But it's one step towards imagining that there could be a future which is democratic. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think I said in the beginning, Belarus is a country which is little understood and it is very complex. So I think you definitely and absolutely managed to give us some idea about this long history, about what national identity could maybe mean and how long it is actually going on. We agreed that we still would have time for a couple of brief questions. And I just take the opportunity while you are still thinking about having a very good and important question related to the topic, which was just discussed. I start with something because I do think also what can we learn from history if we look at what you have been telling us, because recently there have been some developments also when it comes to Belarus. I mean, we see that last week Keith Kellogg was there, and there is still the war ongoing. And I spoke in the beginning at least a little bit about what the war means for Belarus, and maybe you could reflect a little bit on how the war if Belarus could actually kind of support something between Russia and Ukraine, and what an end of the war, if it comes, which hopefully is soon, although we doubt it still, what that would mean for Belarus as a nation state. And please, I know it's a tough question, but the floor is yours, and then we still have a couple of minutes for questions from the audience.
Okay, I'll comment on that without being able to satisfactorily answer it. The first thing I would say is that the official Belarusian support of the war and the participation of the Belarusian state in this war, I mean, allowing Russian troops to invade through Belarus, which is a very striking thing to have done, marks perhaps the clearest possible separation, or one of the clearest possible separations between regime and people. This is not, of course, a popular war in Belarus, but it creates an opportunity, or it forces Lukashenko into a situation where he had to identify closely with a Russian policy, which he'd generally been pretty good at not doing, right? I mean, he was a Russifier culturally, but the war in Ukraine, in a way, forced his hand. It wasn't very long before that, after all, that the Lukashenko regime was arresting Russian special forces inside Belarus, right? So the war forced his hand. Like, the war was, in a way, a dominance move by Putin vis-a-vis Lukashenko, which changed things quite dramatically. It was a kind of humiliation, I would almost say, for him. And the Belarus which emerges out of 2022 is different than the Belarus that existed before, just as the Belarus which emerges from the oppressions of 2020 is different, because it's the next stage after Russia helping Lukashenko to suppress the mass opposition movement, where, in a way, Lukashenko has to then pay back and really act like a satrap of Russia, which he hadn't been up to that point. One can object to all sorts of things about Lukashenko's regime, but he hadn't been a satrap up until 2022. And now he is something like a satrap. But the converse of that, as you suggest, is that the fate of his regime is now connected more intimately than it was to the fate of the Putin regime. And the Putin regime is connected very intimately to the outcome of this war in Ukraine. And wars are unpredictable. The people who start them don't always win them. Empires tend to lose. And despite the horrible character of the war on a day-to-day basis, it's certainly possible that Russia will lose this war, and that means that will open things up for Belarus. That's about as far as I can go predicting. Yeah.
Thank you. Any question? Yes. I see a man over there in a black shirt. Microphone is coming from the back, and please introduce yourself.
Yeah, please introduce yourself and ask your question in the form of a question.
Okay, my name is Clemens. So I think I somehow understand that how Putin very wrongly connects Russian history with the year of 1988. But I didn't quite get, you said that for Lukashenko, the year of 1939 somehow is what Putin the year 988 is, and I didn't quite get the connection of that, of the importance of 1939 for Lukashenko in the way Putin connects Russian history to 1988.
Yeah. Okay. So let me make. You're absolutely right to wonder what could possibly be similar about events that are 1,000 years apart, and wondering about that is really the answer to the question, because in history, things are very different in 988 than they are in 1939, right? But in national memory politics, they can be very similar, because national memory politics is aggressively boring. The point of national memory politics is to smooth out all the wrinkles in your brain. It's to dull all of the neurological connections. It's to seduce you into a conformity in which you believe that your people were innocent, and because your people were innocent, therefore whatever the dictator is telling you to do must be okay. And so, of course, the historical periods are very different. But what's similar about the use of them is the claim of perfect innocence, and the way that claim is used to justify violence. So Putin tells us, I know he had other motives, but I believe him when he tells us that he's invading Ukraine because of 1,000 years of facts which are accidental, contingent, not important, that there's a deep reality, and that deep reality is with the baptism of Valdemar in Kherson in 988, which, by the way, was an attack on the Byzantine Empire. It wasn't an alliance. It was very aggressive. The reason he ends up with Anna is because he's attacking the Byzantine Empire at a moment of vulnerability. He steals the relics from Kherson. What actually happens is much more, everyday and to be expected than the kind of miraculous vision one gets of a holy saint, Vladimir. In 1939, as you say, it's very different. But the idea is that this is the moment when the Belarusian nation was unified. After that came the genocide of the Belarusians. If there was a genocide against the Belarusians, that means that we were. And of course, I'm not denying, just to be very clear, that Belarusians suffered during the Second World War. They suffered horribly. They suffered person for person more than anyone else except the Jews. And the extent of Belarusian suffering during the Second World War is hugely underappreciated in the West. But what Lukashenko does is he takes that and transforms it into this notion of innocence. And by the way, just to be clear, and this will have relevance for your personal lives as well, the fact that you have suffered does not mean that you are innocent. It's not the same thing, right? At all. And so he takes this horrible superabundance of suffering and turns it into a cult of innocence. And the thing is, innocence enables dictatorship. Innocence enables dictatorship because it means that whatever drastic thing you've just done comes from a position of innocence. And so the claim that it's the opposition who are the Nazis, well, I am, as a dictator, I have a monopoly on innocence. And therefore, even if all they have done is do the things that anti-Nazis would have done in 1944. Even if they've done the opposite of what I say, I have the monopoly on innocence because I've controlled the story about the past. That's the way that it's similar. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. Hieronymus Kotbauer is my name. I was wondering about something you said at the very end. You said that
sorry, where are you? I need to see you. Oh, there you are.
Maybe stand up?
Yeah, no,
sure.
Yeah.
You said that unpredictability was important for democracy. So I was wondering, there's lots of people now worrying that digitalization and algorithmically based search is sort of ending unpredictability and also serendipitous discovery. So I was wondering what your thought is about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I am deeply concerned about that, and I wrote a very long, eccentric essay about that for Eurozine and for the New York Review of Books. And I wrote in my new book Unfreedom, I have a chapter, the second chapter of the book, which is precisely about this problem, because I take your premise. I agree with you. What is the technical description of why democracy works is that we all have interests, and democracy and law provide a framework for those interests to be variously considered. And there's something to that. And then the Weberian justification of democracy is that it's a way to keep a state going, which isn't necessarily based on charisma, right? And that's fine too, I agree with that. But the reason why fundamentally democracy can work is that it's hard to turn us into automata. That the thing that we call interest isn't really rational. It can't really be measured. The things that we really care about are always a little bit deep and mysterious and unique, and therefore unpredictable. And that's why democracy is important, because if interests were objective, then in principle I could tell you what your interests are, or a machine could tell you what your interests are. But if they're subjective, if they're not really interests as such, but they're commitments or engagements or something else, then no person and no machine can say what they are, right? And so, but the ability to become unpredictable is a capacity we have to learn. And we learn it from other unpredictable people. And we learn it from, I'll be old-fashioned enough to say, we learn it from nature. We learn it from other creatures. We learn it from encounters with people and things, right? Whereas the whole world that you're referring to, the world of artificial intelligence and social media is deliberately designed to make us more predictable than we have to be. And that's a danger, which is a whole strong tradition. Václav Havel is a very good example of this. A whole strong tradition which is concerned about how the machine will make us predictable and therefore not only easier to rule, but also less conscious of what's happening to us as we lose our ability to rule ourselves. So yes, this was not that lecture. This was the lecture about Belarus and the Vikings and the Greeks. But I've given lectures about exactly that, and I'm deeply concerned by it, and I've written about it, and I appreciate the question.
Okay, I think we can have one more question, preferably from a lady.
So not just any woman.
No. It should. For the gender balance would be nice. I see a lady over there. And then we have a last one over there. I think so. 2 more questions, that should be fine.
Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Helena Shverdo. I'm Belarusian. I have a question which I always ask when I visit a lecture of historian. The question is, why Belarusian failed to build a dynasty, to make great kings, like after Witold, like we have nothing great. We needed to unite with Poland. Why couldn't we stay away from Polish kingdom and build our own dynasty which could fight Russian or Moscovia at that time? Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to start somewhere else because it may be clarifying. When the French talk about their history, they talk about these dynasties of the Merovingians and the Carolingians, and they talk about Clovis and Pepys and Charlemagne and so on. But if you look at all deeply into that history, you realize that it's a lot of people killing their brothers-in-law. It's a lot of people murdering other people. There is never such thing as a dynasty. The sons almost never come to power after the fathers. Somebody comes to power, or the father has 17 children, and then he dies. This is the history of Rus, by the way. And then they all fight for 30 or 40 years, and then someone comes to power, right? And it may even be a son, but it wasn't the oldest one. And so all of these European dynasties, I'm trying to say, if you look hard at them, they turn out not to be dynasties. So the Visigoths in Spain are another great example. Like the Visigoths in Spain, who I find extremely interesting. I find the Goths very interesting in general. But the Visigoths in Spain, they lasted for 200 years. They built a pretty impressive kingdom, more impressive than anything the Franks were doing in general. But they murdered their kings with glee. Like as soon as you became king of Visigoth Spain, you knew how your days were going to end. Somebody was going to assassinate you, and then somebody else would become king. But I mean, I think it's right, and I hope there's no expert in Visigothic Spain who watches this video later and gets mad at me. But with maybe 2 exceptions, none of them managed to get their sons on the throne for anything more than a couple years. It wasn't a dynasty, right? Like the European dynasties, if you look hard at them, they weren't dynasties, and they also weren't national. They weren't national in the modern sense, right? And so Rus itself, which is something for which I have a great deal of affection and interest. I find Rus endlessly fascinating, but it wasn't a dynasty. One of them would die, and then you would have civil wars for a long time, and somebody else would be king. And then retrospectively, you would say, I use the word king consciously, by the way. I think king is the right word for both Rus and Lithuania. But somebody else would become king, but it wasn't the son, it wasn't the oldest son. It was whoever happens to win. And the way that they won, usually involved killing their brothers, sad to say. And so there weren't really dynasties. The whole Rurikid thing was invented by Muscovy with the help of some Greeks later on. The people of Rus had no idea that they were living with a Rurikid dynasty. That hadn't been invented yet. That was a retrospective thing which people in Muscovy implanted back on the history of Rus because they wanted to have a story of a genealogy. And a lot of people still believe it, and like you can find the phrase Rurikid dynasty all over the place, but I'm going to level with you people. There was never a Rurikid dynasty. It never existed. Nobody at the time knew they had such a thing. The Rus only cared about the last 2 generations. And as I say, in practice, they just fought it out, right? So in fact, when you get to the Lithuanians and the elected, the elected or semi-elected monarchy that Poland and Lithuania had, you're dealing with something, from the 1380s to the 1790s, which actually lasted for quite a long time and was, as these things go, pretty Belarusian. Belarus was involved. Belarusian families made a great deal of difference to that history. You're not going to find, like the Poles don't have it either. The Poles, if the Poles look at the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, they can call it Poland, but much of what is now Poland wasn't in it, and most of what was in it wasn't Poland, right? So that's not a Polish dynasty either. And the Russians, don't get me started, like they didn't have a dynasty either. It was chosen by a council, but it was basically catch as catch can. Their most famous ruler and their greatest ruler, Catherine, was ruled because she was the German wife of a German husband in whose murder she conspired, right? And then her descendants, we don't even know genetically who they were for a very good reason, which I'm going to be tactful about because I've already made my lady comment. But let's just say Catherine wouldn't be asking any questions right now. So that wasn't, the Russians didn't have a dynasty either. Like it was essentially, like the Rurikid thing was made up and the Romanov thing was also essentially made up. So you're not actually, I'm just trying to say, you're not really missing anything. The truth is that once you have, once there's a modern European state, it just and the French were the model for this. To give the French credit, the French have gone first in a lot of things, but the French state, has the story of our ancestors, a story about how they go straight back to the Franks. But of course, the Franks spoke German, and we're a German people. None of these stories actually check out. The Belarusian story does just fine compared to any of the other stories. There's nothing in the past that you don't have that you need. Can we end there? I like that answer.
Yeah. Thank you. We have one last question here in the second row, please.
Okay.
Yeah. If that is fine
That's
with you.
Of course, yeah.
Fine. Gerhard Zeller, Austrian Foreign Ministry. Thank you very much for the very interesting lecture. You mentioned this moment of big humiliation that Lukashenko had in 22 when he had to allow Putin using the territory for the invasion. In the last 30 years, the strategy towards Lukashenko actually oscillated between isolation and some kind of engagement. So I know you're a historian, but what would you see as then the best strategy? As we have on the one side the more or less complete political isolation, and then suddenly some kind of US engagement, even if it is nominally only for humanitarian purposes. Do you see there any dehumiliation that can last more, or just an exchange of one visit to a number of prisoners? Thank you.
Yeah, these are difficult judgments. I tried really hard in this paper to concentrate on what I think is the most important thing we can do in the West, actually, which is to change the way that we think about Belarus. So the story that, I mean, so the thing that I talked about is one of many ways one could talk about Belarus, but the crucial thing is to think of it as a rich, interesting, unpredictable place, like other rich, interesting, unpredictable places, like Austria, for example. Very rich, very unpredictable. I mean, the whole thing of like coming out of a 17-year occupation with a national identity, very clever, very good. I mean, and innocence, also a big theme, right? The fact that there's like, we're in Austria and it's like we take it for granted, but that there is this particular Alpine Republic was not given by history, right? It's a result of a lot of contacts, some very clever diplomatic moves at certain moments, and some stories. So, I mean, I'm not going to dodge your question completely, but what I'm going to say is that I think our main responsibility in the West is to help Belarusians in exile tell historical, literary, and philosophical stories. I think the best thing we can do is to, not even in a direct way, like I for a few moments in this talk, I directly talked about the Belarusian official memory politics. But it's not even so much about that. It's more, because there is something specifically horrible, I think, about celebrating an alliance with Nazis in the name of opposing them. But more in the creative sense of financing publications, financing the history of Belarus, because it's that matrix of understanding cultures, which ultimately, I think, fundamentally guides how politics turns out, more than the momentary engagement or non-engagement of leaders does. So, I mean, I think with Lukashenko, it's fine to do what the Americans and the Germans did in a different era in the 70s and 80s with the Soviet Union. Just remembering that the thing that you have to make sure that you're actually getting something in return. Because Lukashenko is smart, and in some ways he's smarter than we are, and he's been playing this game for a long time. So you want to make sure that, as the Americans in fact did when they re-engaged with Poland in the early 80s, you want to make sense that you're getting something significant in return. Well, that's as close as I can come.
Thank you so much. I think we can give you another round of applause. And there is only one more remark from my side before we can officially close. There is a book table outside where you can purchase books, and Timothy Snyder is still going to be here for a couple more minutes if you want to have it signed. And once again, thank you so much. I think it was very, very enlightening. It was interesting. You brought Belarus closer to us, and we can see how much people have been interested in Belarus and will also keep being interested in this very fascinating country, which is not too often spoken about. So thanks again, and thanks again also to the Wien Museum for providing this beautiful venue, and for IWM for an always perfect cooperation. Thank you.